The rain began without warning, thin and sharp, turning the evening streets into long mirrors of light. And Daniel had already been driving for 10 hours when the call came that would quietly shift his life off its steady track. Because favors always sound small at first. He worked as a personal driver for Victor Hale, a powerful man with a tight schedule and a voice that rarely softened. And when Victor leaned into the open car window after the company gala and said his wife needed a ride home because an urgent meeting had come up, Daniel nodded before thinking, as he always did. Because saying yes was his habit and discipline was his pride. And moments later, Eleanor Hale stepped into the back seat, calm and graceful in a way that suggested years of practice. Her expression polite but distant, like someone used to being seen but not truly noticed, and as Daniel pulled into traffic, the city seemed to press closer around them, horns echoing, headlights flashing. The night alive and restless, while inside the car everything felt muted, almost suspended, as if the world had lowered its voice. Eleanor rested her gaze on the window, watching rain trace uneven paths down the glass, and Daniel focused on the road. Aware of her presence, but careful not to look back, because professionalism mattered and lines mattered. And yet the silence grew heavy in a way that demanded attention. Not uncomfortable, but charged, the kind that carries unspoken thoughts. And then, without turning toward him, Eleanor spoke in a quiet tone that cut through the sound of the rain, asking if he ever noticed how quiet the city became when you stopped trying to fill every moment with noise. And the question surprised him because it wasn't small talk and it wasn't meant to impress. So he answered honestly, saying he noticed it most at night when work was done and there was nothing left to distract him. And she nodded, as if that confirmed something she had already suspected, and began to talk, not in a rush, not dramatically, but with the careful pace of someone choosing each word, explaining how events like the gala were exhausting, how smiling for hours left her feeling hollow. People assumed wealth protected you from loneliness. And Daniel listened because interrupting felt wrong, and because her voice carried up calm sadness that asked only to be heard, not fixed. And as the car moved through familiar streets, she spoke of routines that never changed, of dinners eaten alone because Victor traveled often, of conversations reduced to schedules and headlines. And Daniel felt a strange tightening in his chest, not attraction exactly, but recognition, because he knew what it meant to feel invisible in a crowded room, to be useful without being understood. And he kept his eyes forward, answering when needed, careful not to cross into comfort that felt too personal, yet unable to stop himself from being present in a way he rarely allowed. And the rain slowed as they crossed the bridge toward her neighborhood. The river below dark and steady, reflecting broken lights, and Eleanor paused, then said softly that it was rare for anyone to listen without trying to correct her feelings. And Daniel replied that listening was sometimes the only thing a person truly needed. And when the car finally stopped, in front of the Hale residence, a large house glowing warmly against the wet pavement, Eleanor didn't move right away, didn't reach for the door handle, and Daniel waited. Hands resting lightly on the wheel, the engine humming, the moments stretching thin. Until she turned slightly and thanked him, not with formality, but with something closer to relief, and told him the drive had been the calmest part of her week. And Daniel nodded, unsure how to respond, feeling as if something delicate had been placed between them. Something neither had asked for. And when she stepped out into the quiet street and walked toward the front door, Daniel watched her only long enough to ensure she was safely inside, before pulling away, telling himself it was just another drive, just another night. Yet as he merged back into traffic, he realized the city no longer felt the same, because the silence she had carried into the car had followed him out, settling somewhere deep, where he couldn't easily ignore it. And as the road opened ahead and the rain finally stopped, Daniel sensed, without fully understanding why, that this simple favor had marked the beginning of a story that would not stay simple for long. After that first drive, things changed in ways Daniel hadn't expected. tried to tell himself it was just a job, that he was only doing his duty, but the quiet moments with Eleanor lingered in his mind, coloring ordinary days with thoughts he couldn't name. She began asking him for rides more often, not because her husband couldn't drive her, but because there was a comfort in his presence that she had forgotten existed. Each ride was small, polite, harmless on the surface, yet beneath the calm, a subtle tension wove itself into the air. A tension neither of them fully acknowledged, but both felt in the tightening of the chest or the slight hesitation before speaking. Daniel noticed the way she spoke differently when he was behind the wheel, her words slower, softer, tinged with an honesty that came only when she thought she could be safe. She told him about dinners where her husband's attention was elsewhere, about parties where laughter was expected but never genuine, about moments when she felt alone, even in a full room. Daniel listened, careful not to offer advice, careful not to cross the invisible line he had sworn never to cross. Yet, with every story she shared, every sigh that escaped her lips, in quiet acknowledgement, he felt the distance between them shrink. It wasn't immediate, not dramatic, and there were no gestures, no words of confession. But the emotional connection was undeniable. Each conversation felt like opening a door to a room she had kept locked for years. She spoke with a careful balance of longing and restraint, revealing only as much as she thought safe. Daniel had no right to enter that room, yet somehow he had become an unwitting inhabitant. He noticed small details, how her fingers tapped lightly against her lap when she was anxious, how she avoided his eyes when talking about her loneliness, how her voice carried a weight that wasn't visible on the surface. In return, Eleanor noticed him too. She noticed the way he remembered small details about her, how he always seemed patient, how he could sit in silence without feeling the need to fill it. She had never met someone so unobtrusive, yet present, and it made her heart ache with a quiet warmth she hadn't felt in years. Days passed and their encounters continued. Each ride was a small thread woven into a tapestry neither dared to examine fully. Eleanor would sometimes call or text to confirm arrangements, and in those brief messages she revealed more of herself than she did in her own home. Daniel found himself looking forward to the messages, but also feeling guilt creep in slowly, a persistent shadow he could not shake. He kept repeating to himself that he was doing nothing wrong, that he was only listening, only driving, only being polite. Yet he couldn't deny the subtle thrill of connection, the pull of intimacy that had nothing to do with physical touch. It was in the quiet conversation, in the confessions exchanged while sitting in the back seat, in the shared smiles that came at the perfect moments. Fleeting but profound. One afternoon, Eleanor asked him to help with a small errand at her house. While Victor was away on business, a minor task, she said, moving boxes, rearranging a small part of the living room. Nothing dramatic. Daniel hesitated. His mind raced with warnings, with rules he had set for himself. Yet the request seemed innocent, practical, and he agreed. That day, inside her home, Daniel realized the emotional closeness had deepened. They spoke for hours, casually at first, about books, music, work, and slowly, inevitably about their lives, their dreams, their regrets. Eleanor's laughter filled spaces that had long been quiet, and Daniel found himself smiling more than he had in months. Yet a tight knot of anxiety sat in his stomach. He knew the rules he had vowed to follow, and yet he couldn't pull himself out of the magnetic pull between them. Every drive, every conversation after that felt like walking on the edge of a delicate precipice. Daniel tried to focus on the road, on professionalism, on maintaining a boundary. But Eleanor had a way of speaking that drew him in, of sharing vulnerabilities that demanded attention, of creating moments that were almost impossible to resist. He noticed the subtle glances, the way she seemed to search for acknowledgement in his quiet nods, the way her eyes softened when she realized he was paying attention. He began to notice himself, too, recognizing a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, a desire not of lust but of connection, of being seen, of being valued. And Eleanor felt it too. She noticed the steady kindness, the calm patience, the way he remembered small details, the way he listened without judgment, the way he made her feel less alone in a world that often demanded she be strong and composed. Even when her heart was weary, Daniel struggled with guilt. The awareness that each ride, each conversation was slowly changing him. He had never imagined that listening could feel like complicity, that emotional intimacy could carry such a weight. He found himself replaying moments in his mind, the softness of her voice, the fleeting warmth of her smile, the way she would pause mid-sentence as if weighing how much to reveal. The silent acknowledgement of shared emotions. He recognized that these were moments that could easily be misunderstood, moments that could be dangerous if misread or taken too far. And yet he could not turn away, could not stop being present, could not stop caring. Eleanor, in turn, wrestled with her own feelings. She knew she should maintain distance, know her boundaries, respect the vows she had made, yet she could not help the pull she felt toward Daniel. He had become a confidant in a way no one else could be, a mirror reflecting parts of herself she had long ignored. She felt the stirrings of emotions that scared her, a longing, a tenderness, a recognition of connection she hadn't expected to feel outside her marriage. Each drive was a mixture of comfort and fear, safety and temptation. And she walked the delicate line between honesty and restraint with careful precision, knowing the consequences if the balance were lost. Time passed in a rhythm that neither fully controlled. Small exchanges, text messages confirming rides, casual conversations in the car, brief shared silences became the threads binding their lives together in a way that felt inevitable. They spoke of trivial matters, of books, music, errands, but always beneath the surface was an unspoken awareness of the emotional bond forming, an invisible current flowing between them. Daniel noticed the moments when Eleanor's eyes lingered longer than necessary, when her voice softened unexpectedly, when her laughter seemed warmer than usual. Ah! And he felt both exhilaration and anxiety, knowing that the line between professional and personal had begun to blur. One evening, after a long drive in quiet rain, Eleanor finally admitted in a soft voice, almost a whisper, that she had not felt this understood in years. Daniel's heart tightened. He wanted to comfort her, to reassure her, to say something that could make it easier, but he remained silent. Aware that words might carry the weight of temptation, aware that any response could push the fragile balance too far. They both knew, without speaking, that something had shifted, that their interactions were no longer just about convenience or duty, but about unspoken needs, about a longing neither could fully articulate, about this strange intimacy that had grown from hours spent in close proximity, sharing thoughts, fears, dreams, and sorrows. Days turned into weeks. Daniel noticed changes in himself, moments of distraction at work, thoughts lingering on Eleanor's words, small anticipations before each ride, subtle shifts in his mood tied to the quality of their conversations. He felt a sense of danger, a thrill, and a deep guilt all at once. Eleanor noticed the same. She felt lighter when he was near, more honest with herself, more aware of emotions she had buried, yet simultaneously frightened by the intensity of feelings she could not label, could not control, could not act upon. They existed in a suspended space, aware of the potential consequences, yet unwilling to fully step back. One evening, Daniel drove Eleanor after a gala event. The city lights reflecting on wet streets, their conversation flowing naturally, laughter mingling with sighs, and he realized, almost with panic, that his attachment had grown deeper than he had intended. He saw it in the way her eyes searched for his approval, in the subtle inflections in her voice, in the moments of vulnerability she allowed him to witness. And Eleanor, too, felt the pull of a connection that scared her, yet comforted her in a way she hadn't anticipated. They both knew the precariousness of their bond, yet neither could disrupt it without causing pain. That night, Daniel lay awake, thinking of the quiet drives, the conversations, the soft confessions. He questioned himself, his morals, his professional ethics. And yet he could not deny the truth. He felt something beyond duty, something he could not name, a deep awareness that their emotional closeness was becoming something significant. Eleanor, sitting in her room with the lights dim, reflected on her own heart, recognizing the dangerous yet comforting presence Daniel had become. Aware that she was standing on a delicate precipice, longing for a connection that could never fully be realized without consequences. And so the days continued. A careful dance of boundaries and emotions, of restraint and temptation, of professional duty and personal longing. Every ride was a story in itself, every conversation a thread weaving them together, every glance a silent acknowledgement of emotions neither fully admitted. They existed in the gray space between friendship and something more, aware of the fragility of what they had, yet drawn near. Time always finds a way to reveal what we try to hide. Daniel had been quietly aware of the growing closeness between him and Eleanor. But he had convinced himself that it was harmless, that emotional bonds without action could not hurt anyone. Yet one afternoon, everything shifted in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Victor Hale, Eleanor's husband, was a man who noticed patterns, even small ones. And though he was often absorbed in work, he could not ignore the subtle changes in his home. Eleanor's laughter was different. Her voice held warmth that had been missing. Her eyes seemed brighter yet heavier at the same time, carrying thoughts she did not share. Victor was not cruel, but he was perceptive, and he could see the tension that lingered between his wife and the man she had begun to trust, Eleanor. Herself was aware of the growing emotional storm. She had tried to suppress it, tried to tell herself that Daniel was only doing his job, that her marriage required her loyalty, and that crossing boundaries emotionally was as dangerous as crossing them physically. Yet she could not ignore the way her heart raced when he called to confirm a ride, the way she sought his attention with questions that could have been answered by anyone, the way she lingered in conversation longer than she needed to. It was subtle, quiet, almost invisible to outsiders, but to Eleanor and Daniel it was undeniable. They were aware that their bond had become more than mere friendship. More than simple companionship was an emotional intimacy that filled spaces both had tried to keep empty. Victor finally noticed it during a quiet evening at home. Eleanor had come back from a drive, her hair slightly damp from a light drizzle, and her smile, while warm, carried a trace of something unspoken. He asked her if she had enjoyed her day, and the casual question was met with a pause of hesitation that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by Victor. "Is there something on your mind?" he asked, his voice calm but firm, and Eleanor felt a flicker of fear. She could have lied, said she was tired, said it was nothing, but something inside her refused to hide anymore. She took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting slightly, and spoke honestly. She told him about the loneliness she felt in their marriage, about the silent hours when she felt unseen, about the conversations with Daniel that had become a source of comfort. She did not embellish, she did not dramatize. She simply spoke with the quiet honesty that had become a hallmark of her conversations with Daniel. Victor listened, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that somehow made the moment more real, more final. He asked questions, seeking clarity, and Eleanor answered without reservation, for the first time feeling the full weight of her emotions, without fear of judgment or reprimand. Daniel, unaware of the conversation unfolding at the Hale residence, was driving home from an errand when his phone rang. It was Victor. The man's voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made Daniel's chest tighten. "Can you come in?" Victor asked simply. There was no accusation, no anger, only the kind of quiet authority that commands attention. Daniel understood immediately that something had shifted. He arrived at the office, nerves coiled tightly, aware that the delicate balance of weeks had collapsed, and that he was now standing on a precipice where every decision would matter. Victor greeted him without hostility, merely motioning him to a chair. "I want to understand," he said. "I don't need details, but I need honesty." Daniel swallowed, feeling the weight of his conscience pressing down. He took a seat, hands clasped tightly, and spoke the truth. He told Victor everything, not exaggerating, not embellishing about the conversations, the rides, the moments of emotional closeness. He spoke with restraint, aware that his words carried more weight than actions, aware that honesty was the only path to preserve his own integrity. Victor listened, silent at first, and then nodded slowly, acknowledging the reality of the situation. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic confrontation. Victor's disappointment was quiet, but profound, and Daniel understood it more clearly than any angry words could have conveyed. He realized in that moment that trust is fragile and that emotional intimacy, even without physical expression, can fracture bonds just as easily as betrayal. He felt a wave of guilt, not just toward Victor, but toward himself. He had crossed an invisible line, and now he was accountable for the consequences, even if no one had acted with malice. That afternoon, Daniel submitted his resignation. He didn't argue. He didn't seek sympathy. He simply understood that the boundaries he had inadvertently crossed required him to step away. Walking out of the office, he felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because the tension that had quietly haunted him was no longer his burden alone. Sadness because he realized that part of his life had ended. Part of him would always remember Eleanor. The quiet conversations, the laughter, the emotional closeness that had filled a void he hadn't fully understood existed. Eleanor, meanwhile, focused on repairing her marriage. She spoke openly with Victor about her feelings, her longing for understanding, the gaps that had grown between them, and the ways they could reconnect. The process was slow and imperfect, but it was honest. The presence of Daniel had revealed truths about herself that she could no longer ignore, truths she now had to address within the bounds of her own life. She learned to communicate, to express needs she had buried, to acknowledge desires without crossing lines that could not be undone. It was a painful yet necessary journey, one that demanded introspection, humility, and courage. Daniel, in a new city with a new job, carried the lessons with him. He recognized the ways emotional intimacy can become dangerous, the fine line between empathy and attachment, and the importance of boundaries even when intentions are pure. He thought often of Eleanor, not with longing that could hurt, but with a quiet understanding that some connections exist to teach, not to claim. He understood that life sometimes places people in your path to reveal truths, to challenge your morals, to test your patience, and that the consequences of emotional choices can shape your character as deeply as any event in life. Months passed, and both Daniel and Eleanor moved forward. The emotional intensity that had colored their interactions slowly faded, leaving behind a clarity neither had before. They did not meet again. They did not speak. And yet the memory of that connection, the fragile, emotional, profound bond remained, a quiet testament to the lessons learned, the boundaries respected, and the emotions acknowledged. Daniel often thought about the subtle shifts that had begun with a simple ride in the rain. He reflected on the conversations, the silences, the moments of shared understanding, and realized that the experience had changed him more than he had understood at the time. He had learned the value of honesty, the importance of listening without expectation, and the necessity of respecting boundaries, even when human emotions pushed toward connection. Eleanor, too, reflected on the same moments. She recognized that ways she had longed for understanding, the ways her heart had sought companionship in unexpected places, and the ways she had grown from recognizing those needs. She understood that emotional bonds can be as powerful as physical ones, that longing does not always require fulfillment, and that heartbreak is not always the result of betrayal, but sometimes the result of understanding one's own desires. Too late or in the wrong context. Their story did not end with passion, scandal, or dramatic confrontation. It ended quietly, with lessons learned, with personal growth, and with the sober acknowledgement that human connection can be beautiful and dangerous at the same time. Daniel continued his life, careful to maintain professional boundaries, aware of the invisible lines that must never be crossed. Eleanor continued hers, nurturing her marriage, repairing emotional gaps, and learning to communicate with honesty and compassion. Both carried the memory of what might have been, not as regret, but as a guiding reminder of the power of listening, the depth of human emotion, and the importance of integrity. Even years later, Daniel would remember the drive. In the rain, the first conversation, the subtle shift that began everything. He would remember Eleanor's smile, the weight of her voice, and the moments of quiet laughter that filled empty spaces. He would recall the tension, the longing, the fragile connection, and understand that those experiences had taught him something profound about human nature, empathy, and emotional boundaries. Eleanor would remember as well. She would remember the warmth of being seen, the comfort of being understood, and the emotions stirred within her during those rides. She would remember the lessons about honesty, about acknowledging desires without acting on them recklessly, and about the courage it takes to maintain integrity even when life tempts you otherwise. Both understood that the most profound connections are not always those fulfilled, but those that reveal truths about who we are, what we need, and how we relate to others. And so the story ended not with dramatic declarations, but with quiet reflection. Daniel moved forward, wiser, more aware, and emotionally grounded. Eleanor moved forward, more honest, more communicative, and emotionally mature. The drives, the conversations, the unspoken emotions, they remained as a gentle memory. A poignant reminder that some moments change everything, not because of action, but because of realization. That understanding, that emotional honesty,